Imagine a time when a thought, a grief, or a single accusation could erase your freedom forever. When society feared what it could not understand and locked it away behind iron gates. And before we open these forgotten pages, welcome to the channel, where history's silenced voices, real human experiences, and psychological mysteries are explored with depth and respect. So if you value truth over comfort and stories that matter long after the screen fades to black, subscribe and stay with us, because today we are not examining official documents or polished museum exhibits. We are opening forgotten diaries, handwritten, hidden, and never meant to be read aloud, belonging to men and women confined within historical insane asylums. Diaries that survived fires, closures, and deliberate destruction. Diaries that record fear in real time, confusion without context, and despair without witnesses. And these entries don't scream immediately. They whisper, beginning with hope, with the belief that confinement is temporary, that reason will prevail, until the writers realize something horrifying, that the walls are listening, but no one outside is, and as the doors close behind them, their words become the only proof they ever existed as thinking, feeling human beings, making this not just a journey into dark history, but an invitation to confront how easily humanity once erased its own. The earliest diary entries often begin with disorientation, a fog of unfamiliar smells, echoing footsteps, and faces that speak about the writer instead of to them. And one diary describes the moment of arrival as a slow erasure, clothing replaced, hair cut, personal belongings confiscated, names replaced by numbers, while attendants spoke in clipped tones, as if addressing furniture rather than a person. And the writer notes how the building itself felt alive, walls stained by years of moisture and memory, corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, and nights filled with distant cries that no one explained. And what makes these accounts chilling is their restraint, the way fear creeps in gradually as the diarists realize that time has lost its structure. Days blur together without calendars, clocks are removed, and meals arrive unpredictably, dissolving any sense of reality. And as sanity becomes something to defend rather than assume, the writers begin documenting everything obsessively: the sounds of keys, the smell of disinfectant, the way footsteps pause outside doors, because memory, they fear, is the next thing to be taken. And through these pages, we see the earliest stage of institutional horror, not violence yet, but the terrifying loss of identity, where a human being begins to feel less real than the walls containing them. As the diaries progress, innocence gives way to dread, and entries shift from observation to survival, describing daily routines enforced without explanation, experimental treatments administered without consent, and the omnipresent fear of staff whose moods determined suffering or mercy. And while history books often sanitize these practices, the diaries do not, recounting forced isolation, prolonged silence as punishment, and the terror of being selected for procedures no one would describe beforehand. And one writer describes how screams echoed through ventilation shafts at night, not loud enough to identify, but constant enough to haunt sleep, while another recounts watching fellow patients slowly lose speech, posture, and identity, becoming cautionary examples of what resistance could cost. And yet the most disturbing aspect isn't physical hardship, but psychological erosion, the realization that no testimony matters, that even calm compliance is interpreted as illness, creating a closed system where logic cannot escape. And these diaries become quieter, hear sentences, shorter handwriting, shakier, as hope is replaced by endurance, showing us that the greatest horror of the asylum wasn't cruelty alone, but the certainty that truth itself had no power within those walls. Not all entries surrender quietly, because even in confinement, some diarists resisted in small, dangerous ways, hiding pages inside mattress seams, inventing codes, or writing letters they knew would never be sent. And these sections burn with aching humanity, filled with memories of children, spouses, unfinished lives, and pleas too, futures the writers knew they might never see. And one diary describes the writer rehearsing conversations in their mind every night, terrified of forgetting how to speak normally, while another records dreams of open windows and grass beneath bare feet, dreams that felt more real than waking life. And heartbreakingly, many entries end abruptly, not with death described, but with silence, pages left blank, suggesting confiscation, deterioration, or something worse. And it's here that despair reaches its peak, not as screaming madness, but as resignation, the quiet acceptance that survival may mean forgetting who you were. leaving us with the uncomfortable truth that resilience does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like fading quietly to preserve what little self remains. These diaries matter because they survived despite deliberate efforts to erase them, preserved in archives, attics, and forgotten storage rooms, offering testimony that institutional records never could. And as we read them now, we are forced to confront how easily society once justified cruelty in the name of order, how fear of difference became policy, and how silence was enforced as treatment. And while modern mental health care has evolved, these accounts echo into the present, reminding us that dignity, consent, and compassion are not guaranteed by time alone, but must be actively defended. And as we close this final diary, remember that these writers were not monsters, not curiosities, but people who loved, hoped, and trusted a system that failed them. So if this journey moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, because remembering is an act of respect. And if you believe forgotten voices deserve to be heard, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us as we continue uncovering the stories history tried to bury. Because some horrors don't need imagination, they already happened, and they deserve to be remembered. Imagine standing in the middle of a town where every sound you make feels like an intrusion, where your footsteps echo against buildings that no longer expect visitors. And before we journey any further into that silence, welcome to the channel, a place where forgotten histories, real human experiences, and the quiet terrors of isolation are brought back into the light. So if you're drawn to stories that explore the fragile edge of human endurance, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. Because tonight we're not simply exploring abandoned ghost towns. We're uncovering what it truly means to be the last person left behind, the final witness to a community's slow extinction. And ghost towns are often romanticized as frozen snapshots of the past. But what's rarely discussed is the human cost of abandonment, the individuals who stayed when everyone else left, watching schools close, streets empty, and familiar voices fade into memory. And as aerial views reveal crumbling rooftops and rusted signs, the real horror isn't decay, it's absence. The realization that entire lives unfolded here, and now only one person remains to remember them, carrying the weight of an entire town's existence alone. Every ghost town begins as a promise, often built on industry, hope, and the belief in permanence. And for the last inhabitants, decline wasn't sudden, it was a prolonged unraveling marked by subtle losses, one family moving away, then another, until the population dwindled to double digits. And diaries and interviews from these final residents describe the day-to-day erosion with painful clarity, the school closing because there were no longer enough children, the post office shutting its doors, the general store locking up for the last time, and with each closure, the town felt smaller, quieter, heavier. And one former mining town resident recalled standing in the street during what should have been rush hour, realizing the only sound left was wind pushing dust across asphalt. And yet many stayed out of loyalty, stubbornness, or lack of alternatives, maintaining routines long after they served no purpose, sweeping porches no one would walk across and opening shops no one would enter, because leaving felt like betrayal, and staying felt like responsibility. Even as the town slowly slipped into a state of suspended animation, for those who became the final inhabitants, solitude stopped being a choice and became an inescapable condition. And one well-documented case tells of an elderly man who remained in a desert town decades after its last business closed, living in a single room with generators, canned food, and a radio that crackled more with static than voices, describing nights where silence pressed so hard it felt physical. While another story recounts a woman who refused to abandon her ancestral home, even as the nearest neighbor lived miles away. Her days structured by rituals meant to preserve sanity, setting the table for absent guests, speaking aloud to keep her voice familiar, and writing letters she never sent. And these individuals reported a strange psychological shift over time, where memories became companions, buildings felt sentient, and the line between presence and absence blurred. Because when you are alone long enough, the town begins to feel like it's watching you back, its empty windows becoming eyes, its abandoned rooms holding conversations that never quite end. Survival in a dying town required ingenuity bordering on obsession, as infrastructure failed one system at a time, forcing the last residents to adapt or disappear, relying on rainwater collection, improvised power, and long supply trips that became increasingly dangerous as roads deteriorated and distances stretched. And while physical survival was difficult, the psychological toll proved far more punishing, as isolation distorted time perception, disrupted sleep, and introduced paranoia, with some final inhabitants admitting they began hearing sounds that weren't there. Footsteps, voices, or distant engines that never arrived, while others described intense fear during storms or nights when darkness erased all familiar landmarks. And what haunts historians most is how many of these individuals simply vanished from record their final days. Undocumented, leaving behind houses still stocked with supplies, meals unfinished, and calendars frozen on meaningless dates, transforming their absence into a lingering mystery that feels as unsettling as any ghost story. Today, these ghost towns stand as monuments not just to economic collapse or environmental change, but to the resilience and vulnerability of the human spirit. And walking through them feels less like exploration and more like trespassing into someone else's unfinished life. Because every creaking door and weather-worn photograph reminds us that these places were once full of laughter, conflict, and hope. And the stories of their last inhabitants force us to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, belonging, and what happens when community dissolves. And as we reflect on these final witnesses, we're left with a haunting question: when everyone leaves, what keeps one person behind? And is it strength, fear, love, or something far more complex? And before we leave these silent streets behind, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Could you survive as the last resident of a dying town? And if this journey into isolation moved you, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more real stories from forgotten places, and turning on notifications, because some towns may be empty, but their stories are still waiting to be heard. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit emergency communications room, headphones pressed tight, your job built on logic, protocol, and control. When a call comes in that doesn't fit any category you've been trained for, and before we unlock these classified moments, welcome to the channel where real cases, documented accounts, and the unexplained collide. So if you're drawn to true stories that exist at the edge of reality, subscribe now and stay with us. Because tonight we're opening the dispatch logs most officers never discuss publicly. Calls archived, dismissed, or quietly buried, not because they were false, but because they were impossible. Calls where the voice on the line trembled with genuine terror, reporting intruders that left no footprints, crimes without suspects, and presences that vanished before officers arrived. And as distorted radio chatter, static-filled timestamps, and flashing call codes fill the screen, one truth becomes clear: emergency dispatchers are trained to expect chaos, but nothing prepares them for calls where reality itself seems to malfunction, leaving behind a paper trail of fear that law enforcement cannot arrest, detain, or explain. One of the most disturbing categories hidden in emergency archives involves reports of intruders who were never physically present, and one dispatcher recounts a late-night call from a homeowner whispering frantically, claiming someone was moving through their house, despite all doors being locked from the inside, furniture displaced, lights switching on and off independently, and officers were dispatched immediately, arriving within minutes to find no forced entry, no signs of struggle, yet clear disturbances throughout the home, including muddy footprints that stopped abruptly in the middle of the hallway. And as officers swept the property room by room, radios crackled with interference, body cameras glitched, and several reported the sensation of being watched from behind, a detail quietly noted but never explained in the final report. And the dispatcher later admitted that what unsettled her most wasn't the caller's fear, but the silence that followed, because after officers cleared the scene, the emergency line briefly reactivated on its own, transmitting nothing but shallow breathing before disconnecting, leaving behind a call log marked unfounded, yet remembered by everyone involved as something far more real than any routine burglary. Even more chilling are the calls involving voices with no identifiable source, because dispatchers are trained to analyze background noise, tone, and speech patterns. And one veteran operator described receiving a call from an elderly man reporting an argument happening inside his home. Multiple voices shouting from an empty bedroom, voices that continued even as he stood outside the locked room. And when officers arrived, they heard nothing, until the dispatcher herself reported hearing a faint child's voice through the open line asking for help, a voice no one at the scene could explain. And what made the case particularly disturbing was that the voice matched no known individual, yet spoke in complete, coherent sentences. And after the call ended, The dispatcher later learned the home had been vacant for years before the man moved in, following the death of its previous occupants under circumstances never publicly disclosed. And while the incident was officially categorized as auditory hallucination, the dispatcher resigned weeks later, citing an inability to forget the sound of a voice that spoke directly to her, knowing her name. Some calls defy explanation entirely, involving suspects or victims who ceased to exist mid-investigation, such as the widely circulated internal case of a dispatcher receiving multiple reports of a man standing motionless in the road under a streetlight, only for officers to arrive seconds later and find nothing but a still warm shadow burned into the asphalt. And another case involved a frantic caller describing a figure watching them from inside their own reflection, reporting that the figure moved independently, and when officers arrived, the caller was gone, doors locked, phone still connected to dispatch on the kitchen counter, transmitting an open line for several minutes before cutting out. And these cases rarely progress beyond initial response because evidence evaporates, witnesses disappear, and reports are quietly sealed, not due to conspiracy, but because law enforcement operates on proof, and these incidents leave none behind, forcing departments to archive them under vague codes, while officers privately acknowledge that some calls are not crimes, not pranks, but encounters with something outside procedural reality. For dispatchers and officers alike, the aftermath of these calls lingers far longer than the incident itself, because once you've spoken calmly to someone facing the impossible, once you've heard fear with no logical cause, it reshapes how you perceive every ring of the phone. And many dispatchers admit these calls haunt them more than violent crimes, because there is no closure, no arrest, no explanation to lean on, only the knowledge that something crossed into their controlled environment and left without permission. And as we close these archives, we're left with an unsettling truth. If the emergency line is the final lifeline between chaos and order, what happens when the chaos doesn't belong to our world at all? And now we turn to you. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable involving law enforcement, emergency services, or a call that made no sense? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. And if you made it through Echoes in the Archives, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more real cases from the edges of reality, and turning on notifications. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't whispered in the dark, they're recorded, time-stamped, and waiting in the archives.